I'm Jamie Horn of Cranky Kangaroo, and this is my Mini Stellar Quilt. I designed this specifically as a skill building quilt. So we're going to start with an easy block today. You might have received this free block pattern from me. It's block 7 and it is one of the easier ones, so don't worry. But I did intend on this being a really good way to increase your foundation paper piecing skills. So if you're interested in that, the pattern is available on my website and we work through all of the blocks step by step there. We are working on block 7, which is this one right here. So it's a fairly easy block and the tools you need to get started are minimal. Foundation paper piecing does not have to be complicated. I really just use scissors, my sewing machine, some pins. You'll need 3 different colors of fabric for this project. I just grabbed 3 that I thought would look good together. Your printed pattern. So if you're working at home from something you download, you will need to print out your pattern onto just regular printer paper, or even a newsprint that's a little thin is just fine. An iron is helpful, but even that is not completely required. So let's get started. I'll walk you through it step by step. So the first thing we're going to do is cut our pieces off of this paper, and you can use paper scissors if you feel like you need to. I'm going to cut roughly and loosely. I am not worried about cutting on this outer seam allowance line right now. So I'm just going to cut the extra paper off. And then these 4 sections here are pretty much the same. And then these 4 here are also pretty much the same. So I'm going to decide which colors I want where, but really I'm going to cut and set them together so that I can just chain piece through the ones that are all the same. There's 4. And 4. Okay. Throw that paper away or put it in your compost. So I'm going to set these aside and let's do these first. This is a pretty simple, straightforward block. In foundation paper piecing, we work numerically. So we'll start with H1 and then add on H2. So in foundation paper piecing, we work numerically. So we're going to start with H1 and add on H2. Let me decide which fabric I want where. I think I'll use yellow as my lightest. So here and here. And then I'm going to use blue on these sections, and I'll just do my orange here. So the first thing I'm going to do is roughly cut out my fabric. Since we have 4 of them, we can just kind of cut 4 all at the same time. I'm going to put my pattern piece over my fabric and make sure that I've got fabric extending past all of my seam allowances. So I've got at least a 1/4 inch outside of all of my seam allowances. And again, I'm just roughly going to cut fabric, and I've got 2 layers here. And then I'll do the same thing again. And now I have those 4 pieces cut, and then I'll cut the 4 pieces out of my yellow. And I'm being generous with myself here, because if you are stingy with yourself and make a mistake, you're going to have to recut them anyways and waste, and you might as well be generous with yourself the first time. Okay, so I've got 4 triangles of yellow and 4 triangles of orange. So the first thing I'm going to do is pin the orange to the back of the pattern piece. I want the printed side facing up so that I can always see what I'm doing. I need to see those lines because that's what we're going to sew on. So I'm going to pin the orange to the back of each piece. That's our first step. And then we're going to get ready to add on the second piece. So these are sections H, F, B, and D, all the ones from the middle there. And I am going to place my yellow fabric on the back of my pattern with the H1 or the larger pattern section to the left, the smaller one to the right, with that sewing line straight out ahead of me. And I want to make sure that when I sew right on this line and flip my fabric over, it's going to cover this pattern piece. And there's several different ways you can do that. So first of all, I'm going to put it on the back of my pattern piece with only about 1/4 inch to the right of that sewing line. Most of my fabric is going to be back here behind the orange. So once I have it in place, I can pin right on that sewing line, pretend I'm going to sew it, and then open that fabric out and double check. Once I sew it and open it out, does that fabric cover that pattern piece? And it does. The other way to do it is just to fold your pattern back. It doesn't work well with this pin, but you can fold your pattern back right on that sewing line and see, is my pattern piece covered by the fabric over here? And it is. So I can go ahead and sew this. I'm using a short stitch. It's about a 1.5 on my sewing machine. I'm going to start out here outside of the seam allowance and come all the way down off the other edge. Make sure that when you take this to your sewing machine, though, you don't move anything accidentally. We use a short stitch length so that the paper will come out easily later. But for now, we're going to leave this paper in there. So once I have that seam sewn, I'm going to leave this pin because it's a really good indication to myself where I need to trim and where I don't need to trim. So when I flip this over, I do need to trim that seam allowance. You can use a rotary cutter if you need to, but I just use scissors, and you don't want to cut through your paper. You just want to trim through both layers of fabric, about 1/4 inch, and that pin is showing me do not trim over here. This is the good side. So if there's a pin over here, you can't even really trim through both layers because the pin is in the way. So just know, trim on the side without the pin. So about 1/4 inch, and then I'm going to open this up and press it right against that stitching. You can give it a good press while you do the other pieces. So I'm going to do the same thing for the other 3 pieces of this pattern. And I'm just doing assembly line, and I'll trim, and one more. Okay, so now they're all sewn. I'm going to trim them. And iron them. So that's what it should look like when you're done sewing. It doesn't look like much right now, but hang on. Let me finish ironing these, and then we'll do our next set of pieces. So there's our 4 center pieces done, and I'm going to set them aside for now, and we can work on the 4 outer pieces. So these actually, I'm going to change the numbering, so when you receive them, they'll look more like this, A1, A2. I want that bigger piece to be the number 1 piece, and I want the yellow. Let's take a look actually. Here's our block 7. So right now I have this one done. And yeah, I think if I do yellow and blue here, it'll look nice. So we'll do that. So just like last time, I'm going to cut 4 pieces out of my yellow. It does not have to be pretty or exact. There's 2. And I'm just making sure that I have enough around all of my seam allowances. And then I just need to cut 1 more. Let's just use this scrap. Okay, so now that all of my yellow center bits are cut, I will cut my blues. And in this case, actually, here's what I'm going to do. These 2 are really small little triangles. I am not even worried about cutting a specific triangle. I'm going to cut a rectangle, and we'll use rectangles. I'll show you that in a bit. So we need 8 rectangles. There's 8 there. I think this will work over here. And I'll cut another rectangle for that. I think that's everything we need. Let's use this. I'm using my stash, which is really scrappy, so I'm not worried too much about waste because these are small pieces to begin with and there's not a lot I could do with them otherwise. But again, if you're generous with yourself the first time, you won't have to redo what you're doing, so it's just okay to cut a little crazy. Okay, so here is A1, A2, A3, A4. We're going to go in numerical order, and we're going to keep consistent with ourselves. So just like before when we were sewing these, we had the larger one on the left, or rather the number 1 position on the left and the number 2 on the right. We're going to do the same thing here. So number 1 is on the left, number 2 is on the right, and the sewing line between them is straight out ahead of me. And I am going to get one of my little pieces here, turn it to the back side of my pattern, and you can either pin on the line and check. I've got lots of fabric. You can fold your pattern back and check. Yeah, there's lots of fabric here. The other thing you can do is put your fabric on top and fold back right on that sewing line and give yourself a little crease. And then now when you flip it to the right and put it behind your pattern, you're going to put your sewing line right on that crease. That just gives you a good indicator of where the fabric needs to go. Open it up and we're still good. So I'm going to sew all 4 of these in a row, chain piecing. I knew it. I'm out of bobbin thread. You can use whatever technique works for you for lining up your pieces. Any of the ones I've showed you, for me, I can do it by eye. So if you need to use a special technique, there's nothing wrong with that. Okay, now all 4 are done, so I'm going to flip them over and trim them. And remember, leave that pin in there if you need a reminder of which side to trim and which side not to trim. Okay, we've got 2 out of 4 pieces done, so we're halfway there. Now I'll take the pin out, and you can either finger press or give it a good press with an iron. I do like to starch my fabric before I start, and that really helps with the creasing too. It really makes everything stay in place. I'm going to finish the stitching. That's where my bobbin ran out. Okay, now we're going to work on a 3. So we've got some more little rectangles, and see, with the rectangle I don't have to worry about where I put the top of the triangle. It's a rectangle. I'm just going to place the seam allowance about 1/4 inch from the sewing line, and sew with a straight line. So I'm going to just piece these all in a row just like the others. And remember, you're starting outside of the seam allowance and coming all the way down in a straight line to the other end of the seam allowance. Okay, so we'll trim these. Okay, give them a finger press, and then we have 1 piece to go, and we can start putting our block together. So just like before, lower number on the left, higher number on the right. So I've rotated my pattern piece as needed. I only need about 1/4 inch to the right of the sewing line. Now, when it comes to trimming this little bit here, you will need to unzip the stitching from the paper a bit just to get all the way back to the last stitching line. And I'll give them a good press. So once we have all 4 inside sections and all 4 outside sections, we can refer to the assembly guide to piece them together. This is the assembly guide included in your pattern, but it's really Pretty basic. So A to B, C to D, E to F, and G to H. So you're just sewing pairs together, and then we'll sew those pairs together kind of in a 4 square. So let me get this all laid out. D, B, H, F. And I'm not going to trim these because I am super lazy, and I'm going to show you how to assemble your sections without trimming beforehand. You can trim them if you need to, but I do not. So we're going to start, let's just start here, H to G, and they go together on this sewing line here. So they will go right sides together, so fabric together. We need to see the paper on the outside, and I'm going to put a pin right in this intersection, and it needs to come up through the corresponding intersection on G, just like that, fish it all the way through. And then at the other end I'll do the same thing, right at that point, and out through the corresponding point. Now these pins need to stay straight up and down. You don't want them skewed to one side or another. And then I'll pin right on this sewing line, because if I've done it correctly, where it is on the front, it should be on the back, and that looks pretty good. And I'll pin at the other end too. Looks good to me. Take the upright pin out and sew right on that line. Take your pins out as you go. Once you've sewn on that line, take your paper out from your seam allowance only. If it has a letter and number on it, do not remove that paper, just your seam allowances. And then trim your seam allowance to about 1/4 inch. It does not have to be pretty or perfect. In this case, I'm going to press it this way. So I'll set that under the iron while I sew another one. So I'm going to do A to B. And I like to work starting at the wider end. So this is a real sharp point down here. I'm going to start at the more obtuse, I think is the correct word, point. It just gives you a more accurate result instead of trying to start at that real pointy end. Pin right on the sewing line, looks good. And down here, looks pretty good. And we'll press this one. So this is what our first one looks like. Set that aside. Actually, we'll put it right on top of that paper in his place. There's our second one, goes there. Okay, last one. If your paper does not tear this easily, you can shorten your stitch length a bit. It should come out pretty easily. Okay, and then we can join our pairs. So these two will go together, and again I'm going to turn these so that I'm working from the less acute end of that angle. So I'm going to start up here. And same idea. Pin right on the line. Looks good. Now in this case, as I'm sewing, I'm going to pull this paper to the top just to keep everything lined up so I can see my line and so I don't get a tiny little bit of paper trapped under the seam allowance. Remove the paper from the seam allowance only, both sides. Trim it. And let's take a look at how our intersections look. Oh, it's amazing. I love that. Okay, here's our last one there. While I put this one under the iron. The thing I really like about foundation paper piecing is you get to decide how much time and energy you're going to put into your accuracy. So if I really wanted to, I could take some more time and really double check that all my points are going to line up here. So I could put another pin right there in that intersection and double check that it's going to line up with that intersection. For the most part, if I have taken my time and sewn on the line accurately, my intersections are going to be pretty well lined up. But if you are the kind of person that wants to take some extra time, you absolutely can. Pull this paper to the top. This seam I did press open just because it's pretty evenly matched on each side as far as number of intersections coming into the seam. So I thought it would be better to press it open. So he goes there. And this one goes here, and that's our last seam to sew. And then I'll pin all down this sewing line. Looks good. That one's good. And then I will double check that my center is going to match up nicely, just because that's a pretty important intersection. So let's see here. I've got a pin here, and I'll just make sure he's in the right place, and then pin them together. Make sure he stays straight up and down while I'm pinning. Okay, last seam. Pull this paper to the top. Let's see what it looks like. You ready to peek? How fun is that? So that's all there is to it. The other blocks, some of them are a little more complicated. Some of them do intentionally include Y seams because I wanted to be able to walk you through it so that maybe you can get rid of a little bit of the fear that sometimes comes along with Y seams and things that are unfamiliar to us, but let's make them familiar to us. So this is block 7 of the Mini Stellar quilt. It is available at crankykangaroo.com as the full pattern. And hopefully this got you off to a really good start.